Kept you waiting, huh? That's right, I'm back, and this time I have a special gift. This video isn't over an hour long. That's because instead of reading a book that takes 16 hours to read, we're taking a look at Hatchet, a much shorter book by Gary Paulson. Gary mostly wrote children's books and young adult fiction, being best known for his coming-of-age stories about the wilderness. He wrote over 200 books along with over 200 magazines, articles, and short stories, even a few plays on the side. Some of his other most notable book series, besides Hatchet, would be The River, Brian's Winter, Brian's Return, Brian's Hunt. You can only imagine what this guy's most popular book was. Brian's Winter is pretty interesting to me, as it's a continuation of Hatchet, but not like a sequel, and instead opts to change the ending of the first book, extending it for a longer time. I'd like to imagine this extension was the original plan for the book, but being cut due to the book being too long, but that's just my own theory. Now, enough about the book's DLC. What about Hatchet itself? Well, let's do what we did last time and start with a chapter-by-chapter summary. Chapter 1 introduces us to Brian, a 13-year-old with divorced parents on his way to Canada for a visit via a plane. The plane in question is flown by one singular pilot. On this flight, Brian can't stop thinking about how his parents are divorced, along with how they fought and how much he hates lawyers and blah blah blah, I'm so sad, who cares? He also thinks about the secret, which he rudely doesn't tell us, like, come on bro, I won't tell anyone, I promise. Thinking about all this makes him cry, but then he remembers real men don't cry and hides away his emotions from the pilot, who's named Jim or Jake. No, that's not me forgetting, Brian doesn't remember either, he's very cool like that. Jake takes a notice to Brian looking at the control panel and starts talking all about it, and then shows Brian how to fly the plane, as it's easier than it looks. It is, I played Windows Flight Simulator. Now, after this short lesson, Brian is flying it all by himself. Not perfectly, but it isn't that hard to go in a straight line. He then starts talking to Brian a bit about the divorce and stuff, starting to go close until he reveals why I keep referring to him in past tense by dying of a heart attack, thus leaving Brian alone in the plane with a corpse and an uncanny silence. Chapter 2 starts us with Brian in shock over Jim's death until he suddenly realizes he needs to fly the plane now. He frantically looks for the radio but can't get it working right, as he keeps losing the signal. He keeps messing with the radio, but all he gets back is staticky nonsense, with a voice appearing every now and then. He continues doing this until he starts to hear the engine stutter and die. Chapter 3. Now being stuck in a plane with no fuel, gliding over an endless sea of trees, Brian starts to freak out. After gliding, he finally sees a lake and thinks, yup, this is a good place to take it down, and crashes the plane into the water. The plane begins to sink, but Brian is able to escape the sinking metal corpse and claw his way onto land, passing out upon reaching safety. Chapter 4 starts with Brian dreaming about every detail of the secret. He was riding his bike with a friend when he saw his mother in a car that wasn't hers, kissing a man that wasn't his father. All the emotions from that day, the anger, the confusion, the hatred, come back to him and it snaps him out of his sleep. He wakes up in pain and remembers what happened, and then falls back asleep again. After a while, he wakes up again, finds his survival unbelievable, and then remembers the pilot's death. After completely exerting himself again by thinking of a single thought, Brian, of course, passes out again. Nice. Real trooper here. Chapter 5. Brian wakes up again, I know, shocker, and is incredibly hungry and thirsty. He goes to a local lake and takes a big drink. In this time of trial, Brian remembers one of his teachers telling him to keep a positive attitude about things, and so he does. Brian begins walking in the woods, thinking about the silence and the peacefulness of it. Suddenly he gets hit with a wave of emotion as he remembers hitting a wheel on the plane while it was going down, which probably rerouted the plane, and that it will take a while for them to start searching for him. As the panic of this news begins to seep in, he begins to look for shelter and something to eat in an effort to calm himself down. Chapter 6. Brian remembers playing with his friend in the park, where they used to pretend they were lost in the woods and have to find shelter and food as a game. They often built lean-tos for shelter, which inspires Brian to do the same thing now. After finally finding a perfect spot to build it in, he's struck with an immense hunger, which causes him to change his mindset and begin to look for food. He finds this in the form of some sour berries, and without any other choice, he begins to eat them until the hunger subsides and he returns to camp. As Brian doesn't have a way to start a fire yet, he begins improving his lean-to by building a wall for it. After he's done with this, he starts to feel a little sick from eating so many random berries that he has no idea what they're going to do, but he still eats them. And despite this coming on sickness, he's able to fall asleep peacefully. Chapter 7. Brian wakes up from a dream about his mother and the man in the car, but before he can process it, he becomes extremely sick and throws up violently. Perhaps eating a ton of random berries weren't such a good idea after all. After this fiasco, Brian does what Brian does best and falls asleep. In the following morning, Brian goes to the lake for a drink and sees his reflection. He's horrified by his reflection, seeing how messed up he looks from the crash, causing him to cry in self-pity. Brian begins to feel hungry after all this crying, and like the smart little guy he is, he decides to eat more of the berries, but this time, less. Einstein right here, I know. While searching for some other food, he comes across a bear, but luckily the bear means no harm, and Brian gets to go home scot-free, albeit holding his hatchet a little closer. Oh, by the way, he has a hatchet. It's the name of the book, really important. He uses the hatchet for everything, like, literally everything. That's why it's called Hatchet. No, never mind, you'll figure it out. Chapter 8. In the middle of the night, Brian is woken up by a noise in his shelter. He decides to throw his hatchet at it and is rewarded with a sharp pain in his leg. A porcupine shot a ton of quivers into his leg. After pulling them out one by one and all the pain that caused, Brian begins to cry and lose his will to live. After he's done crying like a little baby, he realizes that crying in self-pity accomplishes nothing, considering this is the most important lesson he's learned so far. Brian then falls asleep again. In his sleep, Brian dreams about his father and his friend, and remembers that he can make a fire with his hatchet, as it's steel. All he needs is a little flint. Chapter 9. Brian starts a fire with his hatchet after some trouble with some wet birch. It takes forever, and after many attempts, he finally gets it going and yells out in joy, finally making some positive progress. If only he wasn't alone and had someone to share it with. Chapter 10. Brian takes so much comfort in the fire that he finds it hard to go away from it. However, the thought of running out and needing more wood is enough to pry him away. He spends most of the afternoon gathering wood for the night and the future, and goes to sleep for the night after accomplishing this. He's then woken up by a sound, but being smart, he doesn't throw his hatchet at it, and nothing comes from it, then falling asleep. In the morning, when he goes to the lake to take a drink, he finds some eggs laid by a turtle. This causes Brian to remember his uncle, who ate raw eggs as well, so Brian, being Brian, says, yeah, okay, I'll do that. Bringing the rest back home, he decides to eat one a day. Chapter 11. Brian keeps himself busy with daily chores. These include storing the eggs he's found, cleaning up his camp, and stacking wood. He makes sure to keep up with chores, as keeping himself busy means he doesn't have time to be sad. While over at the lake, Brian sees his reflection in the water again, but rather than crying at his condition like last time, he's impressed with his appearance. He's lost the extra weight he had before the flight, and his skin is browned. More importantly, he notes, is the mental transformation. These transformations include a closer connection with the woods around him, able to pick up on sounds and ongoings in the trees and bushes. He's no longer a city boy. It's while standing at the lake and thinking about all these thoughts that Brian realizes the lake has fish in it. You can eat fish. He can catch the fish. But how? Chapter 12. Brian's first attempt to catch fish is a major fail, just using his hands and grabbing at them. Next, he attempts to use a spear he carved with his hatchet, but that goes just as well as his hands. He finally tries making a bow and arrow, which almost works, but he can't seem to hit them yet. Brian then decides to look for more wood for his file, and while doing this, two important things happen. The first is Brian discovers a new bird he hasn't seen before, which he names the Fool Bird. They are smaller than a chicken, but Brian bets he can kill them and eat them with his new bow. The second and more important thing is that a plane flies overhead. Brian screams and yells and waves his hand in an attempt to get the plane's attention, but it doesn't work, as the plane just flies away. As it disappears, Brian is hit with another pang of hopelessness and wonders if he will ever see his family again. Chapter 13. Brian starts today off by searching for fool birds, which are the chicken-like birds he discovered before, to hunt. While doing this, Brian sees a big wolf followed by 3 other wolves. They walk away though, bringing no harm to Brian. Brian then goes home for the night and repays the luck of the wolves not trying to hurt him by attempting to kill himself with his hatchet by slashing at his arms. The plane's failure to see him must have taken a heavy toll on him, and once again, Brian is ready to give up. Upon waking up still alive, Brian is very thankful he didn't die, and promises to himself he won't let death tempt him again, becoming new Brian, as he puts it. Later that day, Brian decides to take another shot at hunting the fish. This attempt goes much better as he's able to hit the fish after learning about light refraction and to aim a little below the fish to account for it. This discovery reignites the hope in him as he feasts on the many fish he's hunted that day. This hope is different, though, as he's accepted the fact he likely won't be found and rescued, but that he can survive out in the wilderness. Chapter 14. This morning, while taking account of his shelter, Brian notices a skunk around where he hid the turtle eggs. Brian yells at the skunk, which causes the skunk to retaliate and spray Brian in the face. Brian is now blinded and runs to the lake trying to wash himself, but is still blinded for hours. While Brian is busy dying from the skunk, it eats his eggs and gets away. Brian keeps his positivity this time, though, and decides to make his shelter sturdier so animals can't get in, and decides to put his food in a protected place. Brian then spends the rest of the day improving his shelter and builds a small shelf on a tall tree that not even bears could reach to put his food at. After this, Brian begins to think about the problem that he's had. Sure, he can find food right now, but it's really inconsistent, and he needs a consistent way to keep food in the future. After thinking about this for a while, Brian comes up with the idea to build a small pond connected to the big lake, which he can put the remains of fish that he's cleaned and eaten in order to lure fish from the big lake to come into the small pond. These small fish will then feast on the remains and then not be able to leave, similar to a live well. Chapter 15. While in the woods, Brian decides to try and hunt the fool birds again. He's tried it before with the bow, but he just can't seem to get close enough to hit them. He instead tries to use a spear to lunge at them. This gets better results, but he can't seem to get them. He finally decides to change up his strategy and try to strafe around them rather than just charge at them, and the results are astounding. Once back at camp, Brian begins to cook up the bird, thinking about how back home he would never have to do such a thing. Chapter 16. There's been a few days since Chapter 15, and Brian begins to recall his first days, such as the first arrow, where he properly made his bow and arrow shoot straight, first rabbit, where he killed his first rabbit with the bow. At this point, Brian has gotten so good at hunting fool birds that he can catch them with his bare hands. While washing his hands, a moose attacks and seriously messes him up. His ribs are badly damaged and Brian passes out once he makes it back to the shelter, wondering why the moose decided to attack. Brian's crappy day isn't done yet, though, as a tornado smashes through the forest, slamming Brian into the side of his shelter. Once the storm passes, he notices everything is destroyed. Everything is gone, except for his hatchet. Hey, that's the name of the book, that's so cool! Alright, old Brian would have fallen asleep or cried, but not Chapter 16 Brian. Chapter 16 Brian is determined to fix everything. The tornado uncovered a bit of the plane, and he remembers about the pilot and feels sad. He wants to say a few words for him, but he doesn't know the right words of organized religion, so he instead decides to concentrate hard and wish him a peaceful rest. Chapter 17. Brian works to restore the shelter to its former glory and rebuild his woodstock today. After a long day of set activities, Brian sits down to rest, and while looking at the tail of the crashed plane, Brian remembers the pilot said something about a survival pack in the plane, and he might be able to get access to it. Brian doesn't know what's in it, but he bet it has to be something good, and decides to try and get it the next day. The following morning, Brian eats some fish to get some energy and builds a raft to get out to the plane. After a few frustrating hours of trying to figure out how to get the raft built, the raft is ready, and Brian sails out to the plane. Once there, he attaches the raft to the tail and realizes he will likely see the corpse of the pilot, which terrifies him. Chapter 18. Brian tries to find a way inside, but gets frustrated when he can't, and starts whacking at the plane with his hatchet in anger. For once, though, him getting angry actually helps, and a bit of metal comes off the plane. Brian continues whacking it, but eventually he loses his grip and drops his hatchet into the lake. The one thing that's been with him the entire time, and that I probably haven't mentioned enough for you to grasp the importance of it to Brian. But that's okay. After a few attempts of swimming in the lake, he's able to recover it from the bottom, barely having enough breath left to grab it. After recovering the hatchet, Brian continues working on the plane and makes a hole big enough to swim through. He manages to get through and grab the pack. On his way back, though, through the plane, Brian sees the dead pilot's corpse and his face, which has been eaten by fish. Rightfully so, he freaks out and panics, trying to escape the plane, and throws up. Once he finally gets back to his camp, Brian does what Brian did a long time ago when stressed out and passes out. Chapter 19. Brian wakes up and opens the pack, finding helpful things such as a sleeping pad, cooking set, matches, a lighter, a knife, a .22 rifle, and some other things. Brian can't decide how he feels about these, as they would be a huge help, but he doesn't like how they don't make him self-reliant and are part of the old world. Continuing to look through the pack, he finds an emergency transmitter. Excited, Brian attempts to use it, but nothing seems to happen, and it was probably just broken in the crash. The pack is also full of freeze-dried food packets, which Brian is sure to carefully wrap shittily, but allows him to feast on a whole one today. After setting it up and preparing to eat, he hears a plane nearby, which lands in the lake carefully. The pilot of the plane comes out and says he heard the transmitter. Brian is too dumbfounded and surprised to speak. He finally managed to say, "My name is Brian Robertson. Would you like something to eat?" Man, that book was pretty neat. Yeah, I'm just kidding. That's not all I have to say. The story of Brian is an inspiring story of hope, determination, and transformation, watching as a city boy is able to learn and adapt to the new world of wilderness all by himself, and overcome the challenges thrown his way, and come to thrive in the environment. I do wish the book didn't end so abruptly at the end after he got the pack. Maybe get to see him mess around with the items some more, or have time to fix the transmitter instead of it just working. I don't know. That's probably why I liked Brian's Winter so much, which was written as an alternative ending to the book, as the transmitter didn't work, and he had to make it through winter. So he got to use all the new stuff he got, bounce the world away from here, being self-reliant. It's all pretty good. I really liked it. So that was a great summary of Hatchet, but we still have to hit the rest of the points of the rubric, so let's move on to characterization. So last time when I covered The Shining, there were what felt like 30 characters to work through, but this time it's really easy, as we only have one character with enough content to warrant a section on, and that is Brian. Brian started the book as a soft-sheltered city boy, but throughout his time in the forest, he grew to become self-reliant, strong-willed, and full of determination. That isn't to say he didn't face hardships such as the berries, not being able to hunt for food properly, depression, self-harm, the moose, the tornado, blah 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 blah. But these hardships are what transformed Brian into the person he is here at the end of the book, and he inspires readers to be able to roll with the punches that life throws at them. Okay, next point is theme. The theme of Hatchet is very clearly one of transformation. I know you're getting sick of hearing it, but this story is solely about the transformation of Brian into someone who can not only survive in the wilderness, but thrive. I won't restate the whole thing, he is hardship now, but he's strong now, again, but you get the idea. Okay, last bullet point, the interest group. The interest group for this book would be 12 to 14-year-old boys, as that's how old Brian is, and the kids can relate to his thoughts and struggles, as they're through the lids of someone their age. I also think this is every single person I've talked to about this book said, "Oh yeah, we read that in 4th grade, it was pretty good," or "I liked it." I mean, if every teacher collectively agrees, yeah, we're gonna read this to kids, it's probably a safe bet to say it's a good pick for them. Also, I was one of those kids, and who better to take the word of, yeah, 14-year-olds will like this, than the guy who saw it on a library shelf while looking for a book to read and said, "Oh hey, I was 14 when I read this book, it was really good." And the final point was that this book is what got me into nature. It doesn't really matter, but I just wanted to throw that in. And I think that wraps everything up. A beautiful tale of survival and transformation written by Gary Paulson. This video was much easier to make, as the book didn't take 8 hours to read and multiple days to get a script written up for it. And I may cover Brian's Renter, the first alt ending to this book, albeit with more effort put into it in style, as this video is more, I'm going to hit all the points on this rubric, because this is a school project after all. Anyway, thanks for listening to this video, and as always, have a great night.